Sound check. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Sound check.
Committee will come to order. I would like to begin this hearing by stating the Oversight Committee mission statement. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. We will work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is the mission of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I want to welcome everybody here this morning for today's hearing, which is entitled U.S. Direct Assistance in Afghanistan, Ensuring Transparency and Accountability. I would like to welcome Ranking Member Tierney, members of the subcommittee, and members of the audience to the subcommittee's first hearing of the 113th Congress. And I look forward to working with everyone during this Congress. Today's proceedings continue the Subcommittee on National Security's oversight of approximately $100 billion of U.S. taxpayer dollars spent in support of reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan. A few weeks ago, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, also known as SIGAR, released a report entitled, quote, "Afghan National Army Controls Over Fuel for Vehicles, Generators, and Power Plants Need Strengthening to Prevent Waste, Fraud, and Abuse." End quote. This report provided the Secretary of Defense with an update on SIGAR's continuing audit of the Afghan National Army's logistics capability for petroleum, oil, and lubricants, also known as POL. From fiscal years 2007 to 2012, the Department of Defense has provided approximately $1.1 billion in funding to purchase petroleum, oil, and lubricants for the Afghan National Army. Fiscal year 2013, the U.S. government will purchase roughly $343 million more in POL. However, the SIGAR has found the Department of Defense does not have accurate support information on how much U.S. funding is in fact needed for ANA fuel, where and how the fuel is actually used, and how much fuel has been lost or stolen. Despite the lack of records and justification for fuel purchases, the Department of Defense proposes an increase in funding for POL. From fiscal year 2014 to fiscal year 2018, the Department of Defense plans to provide $2.8 billion, or roughly $555 million worth of POL per year. But instead of the Department of Defense purchasing the fuel for the Afghan National Army, this administration plans to give one-third of that, or roughly $1 billion, directly to the Afghan government. Many similar direct assistance efforts in Afghanistan by the United States government, both previous and ongoing, have resulted in rampant waste, fraud, and abuse, and even tragedy. For example, during the 112th Congress, this subcommittee held a hearing to examine the mismanagement, theft, and human suffering at the Dawood National Military Hospital in Afghanistan. For years, Afghan officials pilfered nearly $175 million in cash and medical supplies. Legitimate pharmaceuticals were replaced with counterfeits, and wounded Afghan soldiers were made to suffer and in some cases die without proper medical care. This was a U.S. taxpayer-funded program operated by the Afghan government. Direct assistance from the United States to Afghanistan comes from both the Department of Defense and the United States Agency for International Development, also known as USAID. USAID has embarked on an effort to significantly boost the amount of funding that goes directly to foreign governments and non-U.S. organizations. The agency's stated objective is to, quote, "strengthen the local actors and institutions that are ultimately responsible for transforming their countries," end quote. Without the necessary planning and safeguard for programs like those envisioned in USAID Forward, all too often result in funneling grants directly to unaccountable and often corrupt foreign governments. For instance, in Afghanistan, following a 2010 agreement with international donors, U.S. direct assistance, most of it from USAID, tripled from $665 million in 2009 to $2 billion in 2010. Yet the United States Government Accountability Office has identified a variety of severe weaknesses in accountability measures of those funds, for those funds. Meanwhile, we have a number of reports detailing unbridled corruption in Afghanistan. In one such case, the New York Times recently reported that the Kabul Bank, one of the largest commercial banks created in the wake of the Taliban, lost an estimated $900 million to fraud and highly questionable lending practices. Despite those known challenges, since February 2012, as Mr. Sopko's written statement points out, The, quote, United States was dispersing more than 40% of its aid funds to the Afghan government in the form of direct assistance, end quote. We continue to provide direct assistance worth billions of dollars to one of the most corrupt nations in existence, with little or no effort to ensure transparency or proper accountability measures. And this has broad implications, too. The limited accountability of POL import controls increases the risk that U.S. taxpayer-funded fuel purchases are violating the U.S. economic sanctions with Iran. The American taxpayer deserves better. In the State of the Union last night, the President announced the upcoming withdrawal of 34,000 troops from Afghanistan. With the removal of U.S. troops approaching, it becomes even more imperative that we implement better accountability measures for U.S. funding that is headed directly to the Afghan government. Mr. Sopko, you recently noted, referring to your visiting reconstruction projects in Afghanistan, that, quote, even in Kabul we cannot get the protection we need, end quote. You also mentioned, quote, reconstruction projects exist with no U.S. oversight, end quote. Today I would like your testimony to also focus on the withdrawal of troops that will affect the oversight of reconstruction efforts in Afghanistan as it relates to the U.S. direct assistance. I would also like to thank you and your staff for this report that you issue on a regular basis. But this one in particular, the January 30th SIGAR report, the quarterly report, is full of a lot of great information. I hope it doesn't simply go up on the shelf. I can't thank you enough for I've gone through every page of this. It's great material. I appreciate the effort that you and your staff have put into this, and look forward to a good, candid discussion today. I thank the members for being here. Now I'd like to recognize the distinguished ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Sopko, for again joining us here today, and your staff for the work that they do as well. I want to take a moment to recognize we have some new members on this subcommittee, and welcome them, and hope that they participate in a rigorous manner for the work that's being done. You know, as Chairman of the subcommittee in the 111th Congress, we acted on a bipartisan basis. We investigated a number of different issues on that, one being the United States Army's multi-billion-dollar host nation trucking program in Afghanistan. We uncovered that contractors were making protection payments to our enemies using U.S. taxpayer funds to do so, and we investigated the lack of oversight and the potential corruption in jet fuel contracts in Kyrgyzstan. During the last Congress, Chairman Chaffetz continued the tradition by examining mismanagement and waste in Iraq and Afghanistan and the transition to a civilian-led mission in Iraq. Continuing our work in the last Congress, both the Chairman and I are leading a bipartisan investigation in a multi-billion-dollar food contract in Afghanistan that led the government to demand more than $750 million in overpayments over 5.5 years of failed negotiations. So going forward, I look forward to working with members on both sides of the aisle on oversight investigations to these and other important matters. And Mr. Sopko, your group's work on that is going to be very informative and helpful to us on that. So this is our first hearing on oversight in the subcommittee this year. Sadly, our hearing concerns an all too familiar topic of the continuing challenges to adequate oversight of our assistance programs in Afghanistan. Since 2005, Congress has appropriated more than $50 billion to train, equip, and sustain Afghan national security forces. As we will hear today, our training and equipping missions continue to lack proper oversight. This is not a case of only exposing taxpayer funds to the risk of loss, but can exacerbate the likelihood of mission failure by fanning the flames of corruption in Afghan insurgencies. These risks become heightened as the military continues its withdrawal, reducing both its management and oversight expertise on the ground and the security that is provided to the United States government personnel that evaluate and monitor programs and projects in the field. So we will talk a little bit about that, I think, before the hearing is over. I welcome the opportunity to discuss the challenges that face our reconstruction efforts and the current plans to increase direct assistance to the Afghan government with the Special Inspector General, John Sopko. During Mr. Sopko's tenure as SIGAR, they have already appeared before this committee twice. And we, as I said, appreciate you being here again. Apparently this will be a regular routine. You can schedule us in. Last month, the Special Inspector General released its final report on Afghan Army's fuel logistics that confirmed what we had long suspected, that the United States lacks oversight and accountability for over more than $1 billion in fuel that is provided to the Afghan Army over the last 5 years. The final report highlights the lack of complete and accurate records of fuel purchased, delivered, and consumed. Today, the United States military cannot provide nearly a year's worth of fuel records and cannot account for fuel lost to spillage or theft. Meanwhile, the lack of complete and accurate data means that the United States military cannot justify or support its current estimate that $3 billion will be required to fund purchases for the Afghan Army over the next 6 years. They can't do that because they do not have complete consumption data to show what the Afghans actually use or need. And last, I continue to have concerns over the military's plans, at least until last month, to transfer direct control for the fuel logistics system to the Afghan government. That would have provided them with a virtual blank check without any assurance whatsoever that they would have the capacity to manage and account for the fuel. On the eve of our last hearing on this topic, the Defense Department decided that it would reduce the amount of on-budget assistance to the Afghan government. And just last month, the Defense Department decided that it would release these funds incrementally. While these are welcome steps, I'm still concerned that they don't go far enough and that they will be ineffective in holding the Afghan government accountable. In the next 6 years, the United States taxpayer will cut a check for more than $1 billion directly to the Afghan government without tested and proven mechanisms to ensure that that government will be responsible stewards of that money. To prevent this undisciplined spending, last month Chairman Chaffetz and I introduced bipartisan legislation that would prevent any more money or fuel from flowing until strict accountability and oversight measures are put in place. I welcome the Chairman's attention to this matter, look forward to working with him to continue protecting taxpayer funds and reducing waste, fraud, and abuse. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and look forward to today's hearing.
I thank the Ranking Member, Mr. Tierney. He's passionate about this issue, and I appreciate working with him in a bipartisan way on this. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mike.
Well, thank you. And I want to take just a second to express my appreciation to you, Mr. Chairman, also the Ranking Member, for holding this hearing. This appears to be just the tip of the iceberg in waste and incredible abuse of taxpayer funds. I don't propose or claim to be an expert on Afghanistan. Had visited last year, and I was really stunned by the open commentary, both from Afghan officials and also our military on the ground, who told me of the waste, fraud, and abuse. I mean, it's blatant. They pointed out things that they were paying 4 and 5 times the market value for. I looked at the budget, and I had a copy of the Afghan budget, and I guess their budget is $3.96 billion. And the Chairman said we poured $100 billion in here in aid. This is just one small area you're looking at, Mr. Chairman, this committee, of incredible waste, lack of documentation. Afghanistan is turning into a huge black hole for the American taxpayers and almost a bottomless pit of expenditures. I think someone's got to first expose this, which I think we're doing, and then call a halt to it. The theft, the overcharging, the waste. I think we've got to somehow apply the brakes to this and bring some accountability to bear. But I really appreciate the efforts of the Chairman to focus on one detail. When I was there, they told me, let's see, that year we had $5 billion in U.S. aid assistance, and then we paid most of the UN's additional about $5 billion. I just checked, and they received $15.7 billion between 2010 and 11, 15.7 in a country whose entire budget is only 3.9. And then you heard the Chairman also cite the money going through the primary banking, the capital like a sieve. Again, I think the United States days of financing this fiasco have got to be brought to a halt. I appreciate your, again, calling attention in the form of this hearing. Look forward to the Special Inspector General's report. Thank you, and yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now I recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for calling this very important hearing. And I would like to say that I appreciate the work that I read about that our witness, Mr. Sopko, has been doing, because a few days ago I read this story in the Washington Examiner, which you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, that the United States has spent more than $51 billion to help Afghanistan field, clothe, arm, and house a national security force, but the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction said Monday that Washington doesn't even know the size of the Afghan force it's paying for. And in a shocking statement, the IG, John Subcommittee, said that the numbers the U.S. is relying on from Afghan officials could be a sham, resulting in billions of dollars in waste. I remember about a year or so ago, President Karzai telling the ABC National News that he thought the United States should have a significant presence in Afghanistan for at least another 15 or 20 more years. What he really wants is our money gravy train. I send out a very detailed newsletter to my district on a regular basis, and I mentioned in a brief way this Afghan fuel thing that we're supposed to talk about today. And I say in there about tell about the $1.1 billion and how the Inspector General said there's no proof the fuel is being used for the Army's mission, and it is unknown how much has been lost, stolen, or diverted to the insurgency. And Mr. Subcommittee's report said this program needs immediate attention before being turned over, scheduled to Afghan officers. I sometimes wonder if there are any fiscal conservatives at the Defense Department, the way the money is being wasted. And I think fiscal conservatives should be the ones most horrified by all the waste that has gone on in both Afghanistan and Iraq. I, for one, think we should have been out of Afghanistan a long time ago, but I certainly appreciate the efforts of this committee to try to stay on top of this. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Did any other members wish to make an opening statement? Otherwise, we'll introduce our witness. Well, we're pleased to have with us today, and by the way, members will have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. We'll now introduce Mr. Stopko, who is the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. Mr. Stopko, we appreciate you being here today. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they'll testify. If you'll please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative. We'll be fairly generous with your time, Mr. Stopko. We'll turn it over to you and appreciate your opening statement, and then open it up for members to ask questions. Mr. Stopko.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Tierney, and members of the subcommittee, I am pleased to be here today to discuss the results of our POL, that's the Petroleum, Oil, and Lubricants audits, and more importantly, the broader implications from that audit for reconstruction in Afghanistan. But first, I want to thank the Chairman and this committee for focusing attention on this important issue and for holding the first hearing of the 113th Congress on the Afghanistan reconstruction effort. The impending end of the combat mission in Afghanistan has led some to erroneously believe that the Afghan reconstruction effort is waning. On the contrary, I think it is safe to say that the next 2 years and beyond will be the most critical period for reconstruction in Afghanistan. As mentioned, at least $20 billion has been appropriated for Afghanistan reconstruction that still remains to be spent. It's been appropriated but has not been spent. And it is my job and the job of my staff to ensure that these precious funds are spent wisely and safeguarded from waste, fraud, and abuse. Let me first, before discussing that, provide you an update on our work regarding the Afghan fuel audit. Let me start by saying this, Mr. Chairman, we still don't have the records. As you recall, there were promises made, I believe, that at the end of the last hearing we would get the records. They still have not been able to find the records. Now, in that audit, we found that there are weaknesses in the U.S. Army's process for providing petroleum, oil, and lubricants to the Afghan Army. The lack of accountability there has increased the risk that U.S. funds and fuel will be stolen. We found that the U.S. Army's processes were beset by major vulnerabilities. Our report, our final report, which I'd asked to be made part of the record, includes 6 recommendations to the U.S. Army. I am pleased to report that the Army concurred with all of these recommendations, including one of the most important, to revise its strategy for providing direct contributions to the Afghan government for future fuel purchases, so that further assistance is contingent upon the Afghan government demonstrating transparency and accountability without coalition assistance. More importantly, I believe our audit of the petroleum, oil, and lubricants contract for the Afghan National Army highlights a number of challenges and concerns that we repeatedly encounter throughout our work all through Afghanistan. First and foremost, the POL audit exemplifies the risks inherent to direct assistance. Now, direct or on-budget assistance is funding provided directly to another government's national budget to be used by that government. Direct assistance is designed to allow the Afghans more freedom to manage their own budget and to build their capacity for doing so. However, direct assistance raises a number of significant concerns, including that the Afghan government does not appear to have the capacity to manage the $8 billion pledged by the international community in direct assistance, and that funds provided through direct assistance are typically subject to less oversight than funds provided through projects implemented by U.S. and other donor government agencies. This lower level of oversight is especially problematic because of the pervasiveness of corruption in Afghanistan, an issue I know this committee is well aware of. Now, my agency has a number of ongoing and planned audits of direct assistance programs. As we conduct these audits, we will carefully examine the extent to which controls have been built into each direct assistance program. We will also, as we do with all of our audits, ask the following questions as detailed in my recent quarterly report to Congress. Does the project or program make a clear and identifiable contribution to our national or strategic interests? Do the Afghans want the program, and do they need it? Has that program or project been coordinated with other U.S. agencies, with the Afghan government, or our allies? Do security conditions permit effective implementation and oversight? Do the programs have adequate safeguards to detect, deter, and prevent corruption? Probably the most important is, do the Afghans have the financial resources, the technical capability, and political will to sustain those programs? And lastly, have our implemented agencies established meaningful, measurable metrics for determining success, and are they applying them? Now, finally, SIGAR will continue to do all it can to get into the field to inspect and examine programs in person. And that leads me to the last concern I would like to leave with you today. SIGAR's ability, as well as the ability of every implementing agency to conduct on-site inspections, audits, and investigations, may be hindered in the very near future by security restrictions. As you know, it is the policy of U.S. forces in Afghanistan to provide military security only in areas within an hour of a facility that can provide emergency medical care. This means the safe zone, or bubble, around these medical facilities extends about the distance of a 20-minute helicopter ride. As our U.S. troops continue to withdraw, the amount of territory in Afghanistan that falls outside of the bubble will increase. Accordingly, the amount of programs and number of projects that can be monitored and overseen by U.S. personnel will decrease. Now, I have referenced in my quarterly report that SIGAR has already seen limitations caused by this bubble. Recently, in northern Afghanistan, we were prevented from visiting a site because it was too dangerous, because it was outside the bubble. As a result, 38 projects and over $72 million in U.S. taxpayer money is beyond our inspection. In closing, let me reiterate that I believe, and our agency believes, that we are at a critical juncture in Afghanistan. Our nation is intensely focused on two interrelated and important tasks. First, as we've seen a lot in the press and heard about, it is the transferring of the security responsibilities to the Afghans by the end of 2014. But at the same time, we are trying to strengthen the Afghan government's ability to manage the country's continued reconstruction during this transition period and beyond. I think it is fair to say that the success or failure of our entire 10-year engagement in Afghanistan is teetering on whether these two interrelated and very important and ambitious goals can be met. Now, SIGAR is committed to providing the most robust oversight it can and to work closely with the administration and Congress to provide information that they need to make the tough decisions that need to be made in the years to come. Thank you very much. I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sobko. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I believe there's ample evidence to suggest that the Afghan government may perhaps be the most corrupt government on the face of the planet. It bothers me to no end that we continue to insist on giving them more direct payments, payments we ought to be just making straight to Dubai and get rid of the middleman, because to suggest that all of this money is going to get to the finish line and truly go to its intended purpose, I think, is certainly without warrant. Can we go back, Mr. Sobko, to let's go to 60,000 feet, if you will. We have a decreasing number of troops, so the bubble is shrinking, but we have an increasing amount of projects. Can you give us kind of just the size and the scope of this? I believe that we are starting more projects than we ever have within Afghanistan. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is our concern. And on my last trip to Afghanistan, I was particularly concerned by a number of statements by senior U.S. officials that they were saying that they were going to be embarking, or they knew that they was going to be embarking upon more work and spending more of that $20 billion now than ever before. And I heard that from somebody referring to the Army Corps of Engineer projects, that there may be more Army Corps of Engineer projects coming down the pike than we have before in the last 10 years. I also heard that about AID. My concern, and I think you've probably seen it before, I know I've seen it before, is the desire to get the money pumped out before the clock runs out. Now, as a result, Mr. Chairman, I just want you to know that we will shortly be sending out letters to every agency operating in Afghanistan, asking for them to give a list of every project, what is the extent of the completion, and in particular, which projects have not been started. Because we think that's where Congress and the administration ought to look first and make the determination and ask those questions that I posed.
Well, that could be tens of billions of dollars, correct?
It definitely could, Mr. Chairman.
I'm concerned that you don't have the proper documentation for the Department of Defense's justification for the extension of the BOL program. We're talking about $343 million this year in a direct payment to support the POL. They want to expand it to $555 million. We had a hearing on this in September 20th of 2012. I asked if they had the documentation of that, of General Bash and Mr. Estevez. If on page 25 of the transcript, Mr. Estevez says, I will commit to give you a date, sir. I said, within a week. Is that fair, Mr. Estevez? Within a week. Have you received that information?
No, sir. No, Mr. Chairman. And actually, a senior official told me when I was in Afghanistan, a bit chagrined, saying, you're never going to see those records. Not that they were criminally hidden. I think they were just not
it is.
maintained. We're destroyed. They put it on a disk, and it can't find the
We will need to get the Department of Defense back up here because they promised that they had it. If to not have those, to actually shred those documents, which I believe you have evidence that they were shredded, to not have and provide to this Congress. They promised that they had it. They said they'd have it within the week. It's been said September. You've been asking for it. It's totally inexcusable. And here, the Department of Defense believes that there's justification by sending hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money. We got billions of dollars in the pipeline, and we don't even have the most basic things here. I need to ask you two quick questions. I may go a bit over my time here. According to a report by the Afghan Independent Joint Anti-Corruption Monitoring and Evaluation Committee, the story of what happened at the Kabul bank and the role of the government and the international community has never been fully told. In addition, the report claims that there has not, quote, been a comprehensive effort to identify changes that are required to ensure that such an event never happens again and to ensure that those responsible for the crisis face real consequences for their actions, end quote. This report relied heavily on the forensic audit conducted by the investigative firm known as Kroll, which found that approximately $900 million had been embezzled. According to the high likelihood that U.S. taxpayer funds provided for Afghan reconstruction were deposited in the bank, have you done any sort of investigation of the bank? Have you read the Kroll report? And could you provide a copy of the Kroll report to this body?
Mr. Chairman, I am aware of the Kroll investigation. I'm also aware of the report by what we call the MEC, which is the Afghan Independent Joint Anti-Corruption Monitoring and Evaluation Committee, which is actually a fascinating group of international experts as well as Afghans who are seriously committed to doing something about corruption. I am at a little loss to discuss the Kroll report in an open session. And I would be more than happy to speak with you or your staff offline on that. Other than I know of the Kroll report, and I've seen reports about the Kroll report, but I really can't.
Let me just finish by saying here, it is my understanding that the Afghan regulators, aided by American officials, first discovered the extent of the fraud at the bank in the summer of 2010. Qadir Fitrat, who at the time was the governor of the Bank of Afghanistan, the country's central bank, has said, quote, "We never imagined that the criminality was as deep as it was, that it was so widespread, and that it included high-ranking officials and their relatives," end quote. Mr. Sobko, in the case of the Kabul bank, do you think the U.S. government has been provided the appropriate level of insight and access to the details of the events surrounding the bank's massive fraud? And considering the bank's scandal implicated members of the Afghan president's family and the inner circle, do you believe this impacted the United States government's ability to investigate the matter fully?
I cannot comment on the Kroll report, but it's a serious loss. I also don't know who else in the government is privy to that information, so it's hard for me to answer that. But
I think that our concern is not only the Kabul bank, but the Azizi bank as well. And here we're talking about $900 million. When I went to Afghanistan last, I was told in general, as a sweeping generality, well, once we give the money over to the Afghans, hey, you know, there's nothing we can do. Well, that is the deep-seated concern that we're seeing played out in the POL and other types of things. My time is gone, but we will continue to pursue this. And now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Tierney.
I sensed that you were going to make a response to Mr.
Well, I was just going to say, Mr. Chairman, I share your concerns. I particularly share concerns when I was told by a senior U.S. official that part of our plan for AID money was just deposited in an Afghan bank, and hopefully they'll spend it over the next 5 to 10 years. And, you know, in light of the briefings I received about the Kabul bank and other banking issues, I was a bit shocked to hear that we would do that without proper safeguards to make certain that there's money there. So as for whether there was U.S. money in the Kabul bank when it failed, I'm not privy to that information, and I really don't know. But my concern is going forward, we don't make that mistake. And I apologize if
I think we would appreciate your looking into this.
We'd be happy to do that, sir.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Tierney.
Well, thanks. So, look, I guess this going forward business is what's got us all here. And the difficulty of it is we've had some debates with President Karzai at length in his office, complaining about the corruption, family, other high-ranking officials, whatever. His general rebuttal is always, oh, well, look, 40% of the money disappears when you give it to contractors and non-governmental outfits. On that, you lose some on K Street in Washington, you lose some more before it hits the turf out there in Afghanistan, and they don't get enough on their projects out there. Assuming that we all think that accountability is an essential thing, what's the path forward here? If we don't think they've got the capacity to manage this money and to be accountable for it, then is it your recommendation or thought that first you would think before we would put any money over to them, we would get some sort of a certification along the lines of those things you put forward in page 10 of your testimony? Does the project or program make a clear and identifiable contribution to our national interests and strategic objectives, and so on down the line? Would you think that requiring a pre-certification of positive answers on all those questions would be required before the money be dispersed as an initial step? And if so, who would make that certification in your mind?
Mr. Tierney, there are a number of conditions and a number of safeguards we can insert above and beyond my 7 questions. I think the first thing we need to do is we need to make certain when we negotiate and we sign a contract that we don't forget these things when we negotiate. My fear is that somebody may leave oversight out of the negotiation as we go forward. And I think the important thing is to negotiate that we get access to records, that records are maintained, that we can get there and not only do the financial audit, but we're also able to get out there and do a programmatic review. What we've seen before, especially with assistance to a number of the funds, particularly with the UN and the World Bank, there were very poor controls. But even when there were financial controls, there was no ability or no willingness for the World Bank to go out there and actually see if the money went to the soldiers or the money went to the project. And I'll cite as an example, we're looking at a project, a road project right now. People are doing nice financial audit. They're taking a look at a record and seeing if there's justification. But nobody's going out to check and see if the road is actually there. So it's simple things like that.
But look, we have that problem in Pakistan as well. We went around and around with USAID and others on that because of the dangerousness of getting people out there to check the scope of the work, particularly up in some of the more rural, remote areas and dangerous areas on that. If we can't do that, should we be giving the money?
I think we're going to have to do I'm an old economist. Went to the Wharton School.
So if we put you and all your colleagues end to end, one day we'll reach a conclusion?
What is it, marginal cost versus marginal return? We have to make a determination. And that's what we're saying to the executive branch. We're saying also the Congress. Now's the time. We have this opportunity. It's a limited amount of opportunity. It's an important opportunity to stop and reassess all of that money that hasn't been spent and make a determination, is it worth the risk? For example, Mr. Tierney, if the Afghans can't sustain a hospital, why build it? What do we accomplish other than when some contractors are wealthy?
Well, if they can't disperse and manage and account for $1 billion, why give them $1 billion?
That's the question, Mr. Tierney. That's the question that the executive branch has to ask.
The executive branch already has authority to make all of these terms part of any negotiation, any contract.
Absolutely.
Our fear is that they're not doing it. You're telling us that in too many instances they're not doing it. So I guess the real question for us becomes whether or not we decide to act legislatively to put a halt on things and the disbursement of money until then, which means wrestling with our Appropriations Committee and the Armed Services Committee and all those people that love to give money out on a basis, on just a trust factor on that. But I really take to heart what you're telling us. I said we've seen this in Iraq, we've seen it in Pakistan, and we see it here in Afghanistan. And the question comes down to why would we ever put out the money, without any assurance it's going to get paid on that basis and let it go into the Treasury. We let enormous amounts of money go when President Bush and Bashar were dealing together right into that Treasury, and we lost all insight into it. on that basis. We found out afterwards that helicopters were supposed to be repaired, were still sitting on the ground unrepaired, and other horror stories, and now we're starting to see a repeat of it here.
And Mr. Tierney, that's the point. We have an opportunity to hit the pause button, or at least say, justify why you're doing it. Because as I say in the quarterly report, there may be a reason to push the money out the door for a particular project or program, regardless of the fact that they answer the questions, the 7 questions in the negative. But at least justify it to you. There may be a reason because the marginal return, it's really important to national security, so we're running a very big risk, we're going to lose that money, but we have to do it. But at least justify it, and then hold that agency accountable for that justification.
Can I just go 1 second over if my colleagues some of that? So here's a question for you on that. If we have an area that's outside the bubble, in fact, it's considerably outside the bubble, very dangerous, and a project that we think is important enough to fund, but obviously then we have the problem, do we risk our personnel to go out there and make the kind of assessments that need to be made on site or not? If not, what's the alternative way of getting accountability? Do you trust others to take a helicopter flight over and make a visual? Do you trust others to come back and just take their word for it? What are the alternatives?
There are other alternatives. None of them are as good as an American-trained auditor or investigator going out there and kicking the tires. That's one reason why I go out to Afghanistan every quarter, because I like to kick the tires, and it's amazing how honest some people are to you when you get outside the Kabul bubble and start talking to people in the various locations. But we can use geospatial. And if you can recall from the press, we just issued a report on geospatial because we found out that an AID program, which was supposed to be the gold standard for a list of all of our sites, they couldn't verify 19% of the sites. But you could use geospatial. You look down and see, is that a school? Looks like a school. Maybe that's good enough. You can do overflights. You can also use third country nationals. Now, our concern is that this isn't something new. This shouldn't have been a shock or surprise to AID and State and the Justice Department and all those government agencies that we were going to have a reduction in troops. The administration has been talking about a reduction in troops way before the last election. I think the Republican candidate talked about a reduction in troops. Everybody knew it was coming. But when you go to Kabul, it's like this was a shock. We're concerned about how much planning has gone into this beforehand. I was particularly shocked when we found out that AID was going to be doing a test, a pilot program, on using third country nationals to check out sites in dangerous locales. But they haven't issued the contract. The contract won't come out till September to do the pilot or test project. Why wasn't that done a year ago? So that's my concern. We got an opportunity. Let's not lose the opportunity to ask those simple questions and try to save the taxpayers some money here.
Thank you.
Recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As bad as all these things are that you've uncovered, I read that you looked at 150 out of 2,922 fuel orders. Also, there are many areas that you can't go to because of safety. So, as was mentioned a few minutes ago, I guess that what you're finding out is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Duncan.
And when you use the example of why build a hospital that you can't sustain, have we just built a new hospital, or are we in the process of building a new hospital over there, or have we built several hospitals, or what's?
We're building several hospitals and several clinics, and actually we have an audit ongoing right now, which should come out next month, which I think will be a very important audit for this whole issue, because we're looking at direct assistance to the Ministry of Health in Afghanistan. And I'll be quite honest with you, some of the initial findings, these are preliminary, give me pause, because we don't think the Afghan ministry is prepared. The other thing Mr. Duncan, which is that we're finding evidence of clinics being built, and it looks like the Afghans don't even know they're being built for them, which, again, goes back to my second question. Have we coordinated it? So we're finding problems in a lot of places.
Well, I would be very interested in that. I think it's really sad that we have many people in this country going without medical care. And, in fact, I have a remote area medical charity that's been featured on 60 Minutes in my district, and every time they go hold free medical clinics all around the country, they're just swamped with people needing medical care. Yeah, we're building all these hospitals and clinics over in Afghanistan that we don't even know how many and so forth. And I'd like a little more detail. I think you've made a good suggestion on stopping these new projects that haven't been started yet. Do you have any idea? Are there many of these, or quite a few?
We think there are, sir, and that's but we don't have a good handle on it. That's why today I'm announcing we're sending a letter out to every U.S. government agency to give us a complete list of every project you have on the books. What is the status? Because what we would like to do, Mr. Duncan, is we want to give you an interactive map. We want to give you and the rest of the Congress an interactive map that you can actually push on a site and know what we're buying and what state it is in, and also overlay the bubble, the security bubble. So and we also want the executive branch. We don't even have this now. So as our troops move back and close down military bases, we're going to show on that map what is the implication of getting a U.S. person out to that site. So we're going to try to develop this, and I apologize I can't give you more detail on that. I'm not technically sophisticated enough to explain, but we think this is a useful tool to visualize to policymakers, you here in the Hill also, as to what that bubble is going to mean in the number of projects and the amount of taxpayer dollars at risk.
Well, I'd be very interested in that, too, and I have been concerned about it since, several weeks ago I read in the Washington Post that they were letting a new contract, it was just for $25 million, but $25 million to improve or expand a base over there that was brand new in 2009, and I had the same concern that you mentioned, that some people, or a lot of people, maybe even most people, think that because we're pulling the troops out that all our spending and activities over there is stopping, and yet they're letting these new projects start and these new contracts, and it looks like to me like we're going to be over there spending an unbelievable amount of money for a long time to come unless the Congress does something about it.
Mr. Duncan, if I can reply, I think you and I are of the generation that we appreciate the wise sayings of Senator Everett Dirksen.
Yes.
Who said $1 million here, $1 million there. After a while, you're talking big bucks.
Yes.
And I am of that opinion. When I see $1 million wasted and I keep adding it up, I appreciate what that means for taxpayers. Unfortunately, we have some people who, $1 million is nothing. You got to talk billions or trillions. But I think let's start with millions and save the taxpayers some money.
Well, this is my 25th year in the Congress, and when we first came here, we were talking about billions, thinking that was high, and then we started talking about trillions, and then instead of talking about one-year things, we started talking about 10-year. So I wish we had more people like you in our government, Mr. Sopko. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney, for 5 minutes.
I was almost ready to tell Mr. Duncan, now we're into gazillions with a G on that when the money goes up on that basis. Yeah, I mean, very disturbing, and the Chairman and I are up here kibitzing on how we try to get our colleagues in the Appropriations Committee and Armed Services Committee to really focus on this issue as well, because they're going to have a lot to say about how and when the money gets spent. And it's just, it needs so much attention, and the work that you're doing is difficult, but we've got to put it to some use. Just to maybe draw a finer point on the aspect of the petroleum and the oil and lubricants aspect of that. We've seen this lack of oversight and whatever. There was a part of your report that the Defense Department couldn't answer some of the simple questions on that, And the real question that was out there is whether the Department had indirectly funded purchase of Iranian oil as part of the, in violation of the United States economic sanctions on that. And that would be a serious lack of oversight, I should think. And were you shocked when you first learned of that lack of oversight when you read the report?
Yes. And in a way, I have to give you and the Chairman credit for us doing that alert. It was in the course of preparing for the testimony. I started asking a lot of questions about how we get oil and how do we get oil into Afghanistan. And it just dawned on me when one of my auditors said, well, Iran supplies a large percentage of the oil to Afghanistan. And then you remembered the questions I think either you or Mr. Lynch asked about what was the price, what's the going rate, and all of that. Well, we started looking. We found out that Iranian oil is the cheapest oil. So then we started thinking, hold it. We have no control over the subs. We don't know where they're buying the oil. And I just raised the question, and this is why we created this unit, this fast response unit. I said, let's take a look at it. We could be violating. The United States could be the biggest violator of the oil embargo. So they went out and took a look, and what we found is nobody knows. We weren't keeping records.
Well, I mean, that's not new. We did that in Kyrgyzstan. You know, when we went up there and looked at the oil delivery system up there, we were saying the final thing, no insight, and the Department of Defense and couldn't tell us where it was coming from, or it didn't want to tell us, whichever, but they claimed they didn't know on that. So are you satisfied with the response the Department has given you since you raised this issue with them?
No, sir. Because, again, going back to the question of when we turned the money over to the Afghan government to buy the oil, we have no real controls in place. The ones that the military has instituted, and we're glad they instituted them, are pretty weak. And for example, even CSTICA itself recognized that the real measures they should be using, the gold standard, is independent random laboratory testing of fuel, but they're not going to do it. And they may not have the personnel to do it either.
So it's a personnel issue, not a cost issue with them?
I think it's both, probably. Okay. Personnel cost and the bubble and direct assistance. Once you do the direct assistance, you're going to have even less visibility unless you write the contracts in. Right now, the only verification we require, at least we're requiring something, is somebody sends an email back saying that there's no Iranian oil.
So I mean, the one question here is whether or not this is a conscious policy decision that they're willing to take that risk, and the other is that it's not, that they just don't have their grip around this and have no idea what the consequences are, what's going on. Do you have an opinion as to which it is here?
I can't infer guilt. I always used to believe there was a conspiracy until I started working in the executive branch. I mean, when I was on your side, I always thought people were withholding evidence from me because of some grand conspiracy. Then I went and worked for the Department of Commerce, or I used to call it the Department of Comedy. And it wasn't a conspiracy. It was just incompetency. Well, so I think that's what it is. And again, Mr. Chairman, I don't want to make light of this. I think the problem is, how do we reward people in the government? The big problem is your performance review is not on whether you catch crooks if you're a contracting officer. You get bonuses. You get pay raises by pumping the fuel out, getting the contracts let. And the real answer to all of this is go back to the performance standards you put on contracting officers or anybody dealing with the taxpayers' money. They should get bonuses based on how much money they save and fraud that they detect. And I don't want to filibuster you, but Mr. Tierney, I ran into two soldiers, and I think I identified them in one of my speeches, from the Iowa National Guard, and these were citizen soldiers. Came from the Guard. One was a school teacher, the colonel, lieutenant colonel. The other sergeant was a mayor of a little town in Iowa. And they all of a sudden got control, and they were supposed to run a fuel depot. They looked at it and they said, there's something wrong here. based upon their experience, based upon his experience running a water treatment plant back in Iowa, he says there's something wrong. I know 1,000,000 gallons, and there's no 1,000,000 gallons here. But that American soldier, that sergeant, started pulling the string. And fortunately for all of us, he remembers running across a cigar agent, because we put our agents all over the place, more places than any other law enforcement agency. And he remembered this cigar guy, called him up, our guy helicoptered in, and we started pulling the thread. And lo and behold, they found there were millions of gallons stolen. We were able to arrest a number of Afghans. We were able to arrest a very big political person in the northern area of Afghanistan. And we actually went to the Afghan prosecutor's office, and they even indicted and convicted him. He's serving 2 years for this. And this is all because of a sergeant who asked serious questions. And that's what we need. And his lieutenant colonel who stood by him. And, you know, I don't know if he's going to get an award in his performance review, but I'm sending him a letter. I talked to General Longo at Task Force 2010. He's giving him an award. We need to reward people like that. Above and beyond the call of duty, he put his neck on the line, because usually in the military, you're in for 6 months, 9 months, get out of here. I don't create any problems. He created problems, and he saved the taxpayer millions of dollars.
Well, that, you know, rewarding people like that and getting a much better legal team in there, from everything from procurement contracts all the way through the implementation aspect of it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't believe there are any more questions. I have a few closing comments that I'd like to make, but Mr. Sopko, I want to give you one more opportunity if there's anything that you want to share with the Congress in your concerns.
The only thing I want to share, Mr. Chairman, is to thank you again for allowing us to talk about this, and we're happy to answer any other questions you have. And I would like to submit for the record the name of that sergeant, Sergeant George Tubekis, Iowa National Guard, and Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Golden. And so.
Thank you. We would love to properly thank those that are brave enough to stand up and do what they do, and I appreciate the work that so many of your people do out there in a very thankless, difficult situation. A couple of closing comments, if I may. I really do appreciate joining with Congressman Tierney here. We have introduced this H.R. 327, which would slow down what the Department of Defense is trying to do with these direct payments specific to the POL accounts. The deep concern here is that we are literally throwing hundreds of millions of dollars into what is the most corrupt government on the face of the planet. We know this. They have history of it. Without the proper checks, without the proper balances, without the proper oversight, this money will be pilfered and lost, and we are increasing the amount of doing that. This, to compound a bad problem, the concern is that a lot of this money, millions of dollars, is potentially going to the country of Iran to purchase this fuel. That's totally unacceptable. And as is highlighted here, we may be one of the worst violators of the Iran Sanctions Act, because we're funding what we know could be a potential violation of that. And that needs to be continued to look into that. I encourage you and others to do it. But when you purposely and knowingly give the Afghan government the money directly and excuse yourself from the oversight, you can understand why there would be a deep concern. I really do think that, particularly in this quarterly report, the 7 questions that should be asked of each and every development project are the right 7 questions. I think that should be the standard by which USAID and the Department of Defense and all the other agencies that want to go spend money in Afghanistan and in other countries, quite frankly, that those are the ones that should be asked, because we have a duty, right, and responsibility to make sure the American taxpayer money is dealt with appropriately. We have tens of billions of dollars that are potentially going to go out the door in Afghanistan. At the same time, here in the United States, we're looking at sequestration, and there are Americans working who are going to lose their jobs. We have to cut spending. The sequestration is going to force the cutting of that spending. And so what's just not palatable is to send tens of billions of dollars overseas without proper oversight, without proper controls in place, knowing that it's probably going to go in somebody's pocket without getting the work and the services needed. At the same time, that American who's here paying those taxes is going to lose their job. And that's just not acceptable. So I will continue to work with both sides of the aisle. The committee is deeply concerned about this, and we will continue to pursue it. We applaud your efforts, and thank you for your insight and joining us here today. Committee stands adjourned.